So Deputy Michael McNamara.
Yeah, thanks. Laskin Curl, I should begin by apologising to Deputy Alan Kelly. We didn't mean to interrupt. Deputy Tobin and I were agreeing that there were more U-turns on display here tonight than you'd see at a Garda checkpoint. Minister, you were asked a very straight question, and that was whether you would be accepting opposition amendments, any opposition amendments. And you said that you'd really like to listen to all of the amendments and then make an informed decision. Now, Minister, I'd like to believe that that's the case, but unfortunately, as somebody who understands how Dáil procedure works and procedure in the Oireachtas works, I can't, because yesterday there was a vote to guillotine this bill, which means that we stop considering amendments and take a vote on the overall bill, whether or not amendments have been considered, after 150 minutes. Now, that just didn't arise out of nowhere, because that's not how things work here. The Chief Whip, who is the Chief Whip to the government, and you are a member of government, so he's the Chief Whip to you, went into the Business Committee of the Dáil, and it was agreed. Now, I doubt it was agreed without debate, but ultimately, whatever the government propose is accepted after it's debated, because the government have the numbers. So he said that we're going to guillotine this bill. We're not going to debate all amendments, because you know what? We couldn't be bothered. It's a nice night. We go for pints. Geez, the lads want to go and enjoy themselves. You know, they've had a difficult winter. So to hell with debate. So that's how we're here tonight. So it's disingenuous of you to say that you're going to listen to amendments, because we're not going to reach. There are actually 60 amendments. Now, I've no doubt that we'll be accepting your own amendments, because that's what happens. But we won't be accepting opposition amendments. That was the question that Dennis Naughton put to you. On the broader issue of these amendments, I have to say that I'm not convinced that the issue is whether we extend these powers by 6 months, 3 months, or 4 months. The issue is more the absolute power that lies with you to make amendments. So I don't think that I can accept these amendments. I would accept further amendments by both Sinn Féin and the technical group, and I made a similar one myself. But again, I don't think that they'll be reached. And those amendments require explicit Dáil backing for any regulations that you bring in. And I think that's democratic oversight. That's real democratic oversight, in that you would have, within a certain number of days, in the case of mine, I think it was within 10 sitting days, which means, of course, that's not 10 days, that's 10 sitting days. So you couldn't say that, you know, oh, there could be an emergency during the summer and the Dáil mightn't be able to sit, and the minister would have to bring in regulations, and the heavens might fall and the Dáil couldn't sit and affirm the regulations, and therefore they'd fall and we'd have chaos and nobody would know what they're doing and it'd be awful, because that wouldn't arise. It would mean, though, that the Dáil would have to look at your regulations and affirm them. Because even in the hands of a competent Minister for Health, these powers are dangerous, and I would oppose them. But because they have been used in the past to restrict rights, potentially unlawfully and unconstitutionally, because the Commons Human Rights Committee, which is a parliament from which we copied at the start of this state, and we very much take most of our procedure from them. As we do in our courts, we take our procedures from the courts that predated ours. They looked at it and they said that they were glad that it was explicit that religious organisations could practice. They could open the doors of their churches and they could say masses, Sunday service, synagogues could open, mosques could open, but they were expected to behave responsibly, and they did. In fact, many religious organisations didn't open the doors of their houses of worship. because they thought it would be dangerous to do so, or irresponsible to do so, or that it was unnecessary in accordance with the tenets of their faith to do so. But nevertheless, they were allowed to do so. And the Human Rights Committee of the House of Commons said that that was a good thing, because to have done otherwise would be contrary to the European Convention. But what they did say was that there was a lack of a similar level of clarity around the right to peaceful assembly, the right to protest. Now, we had, I thought, a lack of clarity around both, and I've raised both with you repeatedly. And in October, sitting where you are now, you took umbrage with the fact that I suggested that it would be a penal offence for a priest to say Mass in public. Because what the regulation said was that it is an offence to leave your home without reasonable excuse, and a reasonable excuse in respect of a minister or a priest, and they're the words I'm fairly certain that were used in the regulation, included saying Mass in public. Excluded saying Mass only if it was online. So by extension, saying Mass in public was not a reasonable excuse, and in so saying Mass in public or carrying out another religious ceremony, a priest was carrying out a criminal offence. Now, you explicitly stood up in the Dáil and you said, I read these regulations myself last night. I can assure the Deputy it is not a penal offence, and it will remain thus. Now, that particular regulation lapsed in December, when we were all having the meaningful Christmas that Neffet dreamt up, this disastrous campaign to justify an unnecessary lockdown at the start of October. But then they were reintroduced in January, word for word, comma for comma, line by line. And the ones that you said were not a penal offence were challenged in our courts. And legal counsel for the government, i.e. your legal representatives, clarified to the court that it was a penal offence to say Mass in public. Now, that worries me on a number of levels. It worries me on the level that we're potentially infringing on constitutional rights. But it worries me even more that you assure this House that it's not a penal offence. You've read them yourself. You know what you're doing. And that what's being suggested by the opposition is just wrong. And then, in fact, your lawyers clarified the exact opposite to the courts. Now, Minister, did you read them the night before, as you told the House you did, or did you not read them the night before? And if you read them, did you not understand them? And if you didn't understand them, did you not take legal advice on them? Because how did we arrive at the situation that the polar opposite to what you assured the House was the case was in fact the government's position in the courts? Because if you didn't understand what you were signing with regard to religious freedom, then how are we to believe that you understood what you were signing with regard to the impact that they were having on any other of the panoply of rights that exist, that inhere in human beings across this state, that this Constitution and that this constitutional order is here to protect? I raised this before and you said you didn't understand the question, Minister. Well, I'll be very simple. Did you tell fibs to this House with respect to the fact that you read the regulations, that you understood the regulations, or the import of the regulations? Because it was surely one of the three. And the huge powers that you have under these regulations makes me very uneasy. As I said, were you an entirely competent minister, I'd still be uneasy. But you have unfortunately, and I say this with sadness, you've demonstrated otherwise to this House, on the floor of this House. And I invited you to explain the scenario, to retract maybe what you said, and explain how it came about, but you declined to do so. But now, here you are saying, guys, because, you know, that's the lingo of the sort of management consultants. Trust me. It's a bit like, trust me, I'm a doctor. Sorry, pardon the pun. But I would say with regard to NPHET, and we've heard NPHET mentioned, like most of these powers were called for by NPHET. We've seen NPHET give public health advice. I don't have a problem with that per se. But we do need somebody to give the government public health advice, and who better than the Chief Medical Officer. But policing advice, that we should, how we should police these, that we should police these, that we should not allow people to gather. All these things are not really matters of public health advice. These are matters of state. So I am concerned that NPHET has massively overreached its function. Now, even NPHET, I mean, okay, it's led by the Chief Medical Officer, so it's obvious why he's on it, because he's the Chief Medical Officer, as is the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, but there are others. Now, I've been contacted by many doctors in the past 6 months from across this state who work in public hospitals, who work with people who've contracted COVID, work in very difficult circumstances, who completely oppose the position that you have put forward and advocated as Minister for Health. And not alone have you put it forward and advocated for it, you've made it a criminal offence not to agree with it. Now, that's not democracy, that you can do that with the stroke of a pen without being accountable to any committee, any House. Because why, let me phrase it differently, why would you not want to, if particularly in circumstances where you know when a regulation is going to expire, because it's written, it's on the end of the regulation when it will expire. So you know with 2 weeks back, 1 week back, that you will have to introduce another one if you need to introduce another regulation, if the advice that you have from NPHET is that another one is necessary. So why would you not want to go before a committee and tease it out, so that what is a penal offence and what's not a penal offence would be clearly understood? Why would you not want to tease that out in a democracy? I simply don't understand that, other than a tendency to authoritarianism. And that doesn't just worry me, that frightens me. And I come from a part of the country that's very proud of its tradition, for a long time before the end of British rule in this state, and for a long time since British rule in this state ended, for its tendency to freedom and to protect freedom. And many paid the ultimate sacrifice. And in fact, some of those who paid the ultimate sacrifice couldn't even be commemorated because of the pandemic that was in place. Now, I'm not suggesting that it was right to have large commemorations. On the contrary, I wouldn't feel comfortable in a large crowd at the moment. But what I'm saying is it is wrong to impose public health advice through the criminal law. And it's even more wrong to do it when you're doing it by way of delegated legislation. And it's wronger still when you remove any possibility of any checks and balances in this House to look at what's being done. Now, I asked last week, last month, and last year, do we have any idea of the mental health impact on this and the impact on suicides? And I note that the CSO last week announced the number of deaths last year. And that's as recorded now, of course, on May 22nd, if I'm not mistaken, the date was, but it was certainly in May. The number of deaths and the number of suicides. And thankfully, the number of suicides were down in last year. But that doesn't really tell us much, because we know that It is one thing you have to record a death in Ireland within 3 months, so the vast majority of deaths are recorded within 3 months. Now, but it can sometimes take a lot longer to record the cause of death. Sometimes there has to be a coroner's court. And of course, all courts, including coroner's courts, there was a big delay in them last year. So there's a delay in establishing the cause of death. I hope that suicides were down in 2020. But the information that we have to hand only says that the number of suicides recorded in 2020 as of May are down, and they're two entirely different things. But what is interesting is that the number of deaths recorded, again, there could be a delay in recording deaths, but it's less likely because, I don't mean to be glib, but it's relatively easy to establish, it's much easier to establish whether somebody is alive or dead than it is to establish the cause of death. So most people's deaths are recorded, most people who died in 2020 would be recorded by May. But the number of deaths recorded were up on the number of deaths recorded in respect of 2019 in May 2020. So even if there was a delay, if the delay was similar, then the number of deaths was up by 600. Now, 600 is about 2%. And of course, in respect of each of those, and I've lost maybe more people close to me than many at my age, and I know what it's like to grieve for a loved one, and I know how awful it is, but equally I know that I have to go on living for the living. So I don't wish to minimize the deaths of the 600 people. They're hugely important, but I do wish to say that it was 600 up on what it was the previous year. That's 2%. That's the same increase in deaths that took place between 2017 and 2018 as took place between 2019 and 2020. And that again causes me to question not whether there's a pandemic, because there clearly is a pandemic. Not that whether people need to be cautious. They clearly do need to be cautious. But whether some of the restrictions that were put in place, using the police to police, using An Garda Síochána to police public health measures, whether all of that was necessary or proportionate or even advised. It does cause me to question that. On the issue of fines, Deputy Paul Murphy has drawn considerable attention to this, and it's hardly surprising, but most of the fines are handed out in a couple of areas in this state. You know, and I warned last summer, or towards the end of the summer, that we were effectively going to penalise poverty through some of these COVID restrictions. And that's what we've done, because, you know, it wasn't Greystones, it wasn't East Clare where fines were high. It was parts of the state that this state has consistently failed. It was part of this state where people are poor. That's where the fines were. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, whether they'll be paid or not, because, of course, there are all sorts of constitutional frailties in much of this legislation. Deputy Naughton at the start talked about, you know, we gave the police powers to do all of this last March. Well, we didn't. Actually, incrementally, we gave you more powers as the year went on, not less, because we were acting blind in March 2020. And we did bring in the Health Amendment Act. But it wasn't until October that we gave the police powers to issue lots of fines, and those fine powers were subsequently increased. And then, of course, the mandatory hotel quarantine fiasco was introduced after Christmas. And you yourself, rather interestingly, have said that those, if the mandatory hotel quarantining regime had been in place before Christmas, it wouldn't have stopped what happened at Christmas. Now, I found that astounding, because if it wouldn't have stopped what happened at Christmas, what was the point? Because what we have surely done is made Belfast International Airport a success story after a lot of years of stagnation. And Shannon, which was enjoying some nascent success after looking forward to some difficulties, has plummeted.
Belfast Airport was closed to international travel.
It's now open to international travel. Lots of citizens of this, lots of people from this state travel through Belfast to travel internationally, as we speak. So that's, it seems to me, what we have achieved by this. So, Minister, I do hope that you will call off the guillotine and say, you know what, These powers are extreme. Let's debate them. Let's sit through tomorrow, Friday, Saturday. I doubt there's a rock concert in here on Sunday either. There's plenty of time, plenty of space. Let's debate them. Let's get back to democracy. Let's return to normality in some shape or form. I oppose the particular amendments. Thank you, Lascian Corla.
Thank you, Deputy.